name's Joe Pfeiffer, and this is the first video on a new channel that I'm creating called Hi-Pfeif. For this first video, I wanted to show how I like to finish and terminate speaker cables. I always like to do my cables with banana plugs on one side, specifically the side where you plug it into the power amp or the receiver. And then the other end I like to always do in spades. I just found this kind of is better for the cable because it can hang and take the pressure hanging off the back of a speaker easier this way. The first thing is a good pair of wire cutters. This is probably the tool you'll use the most for the whole project. I like to only use the holes in the wire cutter to actually strip the plastic sleeve off the wires. The wire cutting part of the cutters is usually not the best. Instead, I like to use a pair of snips. I find snips are just a lot more exact. You could also use just a razor blade. Some plugs require screws on the end, so you might need a little screwdriver. They also sell plugs that don't require screws, and so if you have those, you may not need a screwdriver. And you'll also need a hairdryer. The hairdryer is how you're actually going to apply heat around the heat shrink tubing to be able to close it. Like I said before, I tend to gravitate towards using spade plugs on the end of the speaker because it hangs and doesn't break quite as easily. And then I like to use banana plugs to kind of go straight into the receiver or the amp where it's on a shelf and has a little more support. I actually have both plug types here. These don't require screws. They're just hand twist. These do require screws, so you can kind of see how both of them work. You'll need a set of heat shrink tubing. They sell this in different sizes, different colors and lengths. So get a color that looks nice on your speaker cables. You can tend to buy this for a couple bucks and get a ton of them, and so they'll last, a lifetime basically. But this is kind of the key part of making the end look really nice and finished after you put the plugs on. And lately, I've just started to discover these cable pants. And so these are kind of like the heat shrink tubes, but what's neat is that it's kind of a Y splitter. And so instead of having two heat shrink tubes and a third where you have a seam and kind of a split, this is all finished into one. And so I just found these tend to make the cable look kind of nice. And they're also fairly cheap. So this is kind of a nice thing if you want to add a little extra on top. This just makes it a lot easier to figure out what order to put stuff in and to make sure that you have everything kind of cut to the right length so you're not just like left holding something when you need to then go cut another part of it. They start from the base and work towards the end, and that applies to this cable too. It's always easier to start cutting from the thicker part and going this way than to start from the tip and go in. And the worst thing you can do is to finish at the end here and then realize you didn't put the jacket on the base here and you can't fit it over the terminator anymore. Start with the heat shrink tubing here that you have as kind of the first part. I made sure that I had a size here that is just like a little bit bigger than what this cable is. And so this can go over. You're not going to actually shrink it right now, so you can just slide it on and just like leave it on here. We'll pull it forward when we actually do need to like close off this end. And so we'll do this on both ends here. And I usually just leave maybe an inch or two, so not a ton, just enough to kind of hold the sheathing and make it nice and tight. I actually only put heat shrink tubing on the spade ends. These banana plugs, I just don't have heat shrink tubing that's quite big enough to go over these, and I kind of don't mind these as much because they're a little bit thicker and have finished ends here. And so I'm just going to leave the heat shrink tubing off the banana plugs. I kind of measure it just using this part itself. And so if I look at this plug, I know that the cable can go up to kind of this part of the plug here where the bump is. And so if I hold this up here, I can tell like that's about how much speaker cable I need to actually strip off, just like this black part forward. And so what I'll do is I'll kind of hold this here and I'll take the razor blade and actually just mark right here, right on the cable itself, like how much I actually need to cut. So this is now telling me how much of this black or white sheath I need to remove to expose the actual wires. I don't want to remove any more wire than that because I don't want bare wire sticking out of the bottom of this plug, and I want it to be kind of completely sealed in there. Before I do that though, I'll want to make sure to have this red heat shrink tubing over this because again, once that's on, I'm not going to be able to put this on, so I need to start from the back and kind of move forward. But I also need to cut more of this really thick cable off. And so this is where it's a little bit tricky since I'm going to actually hold this to figure out how much I need to cut here. But then I also know that this cable tubing is not going to go over this part. And so if I hold these kind of together in order, I can kind of see all the way back to the base here how much I need to cut. And so if I look at this way, I can kind of see here's about the point I need to cut. And I'll do the same thing kind of with the razor blade here and just mark where I need to cut the actual sheath itself. Start cutting the sheath off now that we marked it. I'll start with the bigger part, like I said, to work kind of forward. Since this is such a thick gauge, I can't actually use a wire cutter. I need to just cut it manually with a razor here. There's enough plastic protection in here. I'm not worried about cutting all the way through this cable and severing like the inside cable too. And so I can cut pretty hard, but just kind of slowly with a razor blade here, just kind of saw back and forth and kind of work around the circumference of this. And as you get kind of closer, you can kind of start to twist this too, and you'll see it will even kind of break apart that way. And so you kind of just go slowly here, keep cutting away. You can kind of see the pieces of plastic that are maybe still holding on to it. And once you get it kind of close enough to then, you can kind of just twist it and then rip it off. And like I said, this cable, the plastic's pretty thick. There is a lot of like cloth and kind of paper in here. And so that's what protected this from cutting through into this part of the cable as well. But now I'll use the snips to actually remove all this plastic and paper here. Just kind of get it cleaned up. The cleaner this gets, the easier it is going to be for the joint too, because this is where the cable pants will kind of sit nice and close to everything. And so I'll start usually with just taking the biggest chunks off. And then for these, I mark down there too with the razor kind of where to cut these two wires forward. And this is where I will use the wire cutter. I'll use the 10 gauge here, which is the top, and that's what thickness these wires are. And so if I come into here and actually look at where it is, I can just kind of cut it. And then I like to just spin like this. That's just an easier way to cut it without putting too much pressure down on it. If it doesn't cut all the way to, you can use the same kind of trick and, just bend it back and forth and try to just pull it off, or you can use the ends here to kind of pull it off that way as well. And so once you've done this on both of them, you'll kind of have the actual wire part now exposed. The sheath is taken off, it's time to start putting on the cable sleeves and the actual heat shrink tubing. Again, we're going to work from the base towards the tip instead of the other way around. And so we'll start with the cable pants here. You slide them over both of these so that they both stick out at the end. If the cable pants is big enough, you might be able to fit this base over and really get a nice tight seam here. But since my sheath is so thick, I can only butt up against the bottom here. And so I'm going to use this heat shrink tubing to actually cover up that seam. And then you want to make sure to put on this heat shrink tubing next. If you put these on first, you won't be able to put the heat shrink tubing over these. And so we'll kind of line these up as well. And so now we're ready for the actual tips. And you want to make sure that you line up the phases, the black and red or black and white sometimes. And so if we look at the cable here, it's black kind of on the top and white on the bottom. And so this is my black plug and this is my white plug. And so I'll make sure that they're the right phase here. And when this is all lined up, they kind of fit all perfectly together. And so now all I have to do is tighten the screws on this one, since these are the types of tips that have screws in them. And then I'll slide over the tubing to actually cover it up. I'm going to show the banana plugs here next, since this is a little bit of a different style without screws. They're twists on. The process is the same though. Start from the base, make sure you have the heat shrink tubing on here and the cables are cut to the right length. And then you'll start with the cable pants. Once you have all of these lined up, you'll see that the way these work is you can actually twist the ends off. They actually make different types too, so you could even get these as spades. But the inside of them is just basically like a hole that you can insert the cable into, and then the idea is you wrap the end of the cable kind of around the twist here. But to do that, you'll need to unravel the speaker cable here, because if you pull this back, you'll notice that there's actually a plastic spleen in the middle of the cable. And so what you'll want to do is actually cut that spleen off of the cable end here. And so you can do that actually before you put it in, or if you prefer, you could actually put it in and then bend it over and cut it afterwards. It doesn't really matter. I like to do it beforehand because I just feel like it's a little bit easier to get through there. And so you just snip the little spleen off. You can put it back. Most cable like this too, you'll notice that it's actually twisted kind of counterclockwise if you're looking directly into the cable. And so once you have that part done, all you have to do then is slide this over, and you just want a little bit of this to be sticking out. And you kind of want to then twist it and then splay it over the end as much as you can. You don't need a ton here. If you get too much in here, it'll be too hard to screw the top back in. And so you can kind of just futz with it. It doesn't have to be perfect. You just want a tight enough connection that the screw goes over it, and it kind of fits snugly. And so you can kind of just try to get it as even as possible so it's not just all clumped up on one side or the other. And then sometimes another trick that I've found helpful is to use your wire cutters here. You can actually use the end and kind of almost like crimp the wires down just to get this really, really solid and tight kind of around it. Once you have it though tight enough, again, it might take a little bit of going back and forth, but then you just take the top here and screw it right on over it. And you'll tell if it's too bunched up, this won't screw all the way down or it'll get really tight. If it's too loose, you'll be able to pull it off. And so a good test after you're done is to make sure that you can't actually pull the end off. And that's all there is to it. So this is a little bit easier because you don't have to screw it in, but it's a little bit more putsy because you do have to actually cut the spleen and splay the ends over like that. Final step here is to actually shrink the heat shrink tubing, which is by far the most satisfying part of this whole process. So everything's kind of lined up. I just have to like slide this over, try to make sure that the seam here is about halfway between, so there's, you know, equal basically pressure on each side. I won't always do that for the ends though. For the tips here, what I like to do is just push these as far up as I can go to cover up the screw holes. And so that means the seam is a little bit closer to the end here. That's just a personal preference. It probably doesn't matter a ton. I think secure wise, it's probably relatively similar. And so just take one end that you want to start with, get everything kind of lined up here. And what's nice too is if you use all black, like this will look very seamless. I like to do kind of more of a contrasting here too. Some people too, if you have different colors, you may want to do the black versus red or white versus black, if that makes it easier to kind of tell the difference. But yeah, just get everything lined up. It'll be kind of loose. And then what you're going to do is take your hair dryer here and you want to apply quite a bit of heat, pretty close to it, because a hair dryer isn't going to get too hot. If you do have like an industrial like heat gun, you might have to be a little bit more careful with it, but it's pretty hard to overdo this. It won't really burn, not at least with a hair dryer. And so you just kind of, you know, hold it around and apply the heat so that it shrinks as you do this. So I'll turn it on. And that's it. You don't really need to put it for more than, maybe a minute or so. And you'll see that it shrinks pretty tightly here. You'll see even maybe where the seam is, unless it covers it up. But yeah, you get these really nice finished seams this way. And it makes it also a lot more secure if you're taking the cable in and out. Label your cables so you can tell them apart. Especially the speaker side may not matter so much, but since these two sides are going to be going into the amp, if you ever are switching components, you may actually get these mixed up because you can't really tell which one is which. And so if you use black heat shrink tubing like this, you can actually get like white or silver Sharpies, which is a nice contrast. If you're using a light colored heat shrink, you could just use a black Sharpie like normal. Easy to tell this apart from left and right. And that way, when you're hooking and unhooking stuff, you can kind of tell them apart. So that's another easy trick if you got the cables nice and labeled when you're looking at them on the back of the amp.